terrible things have happened in this world. What did God know and when did he know it? That is the basic question for debate between not only Calvinism, which is sort of one extreme, and we used to think Arminianism was the other extreme, but now we have open theism to consider and Molinism to consider, as well as the Lutheran position. That's its own thing, all to answer the question, what did God know and when did he know it? And that has implications for the other question of, well then, how responsible is God for the bad things that might happen? And I want to touch on those theological schools of thought and then end with, and what I'm really going to get to, is what the Christ-centered model can add to the discussion. I think it can open up some possibilities that really had not been on the table before. So let's start with just a brief overview. What are these schools of thought? What are their positions? And then from there, what the Christ-centered model can add to the discussion. This question of what did God know and when did he know it applies to a lot of questions where moral evil is involved. Salvation is, of course, the primary one. I mean, bad things do happen, but getting tossed into hell for eternity is the worst thing that could happen. And, of course, going to heaven is the best thing that could happen. And so that is the primary question, or the starting question, where we consider this issue of God's knowledge versus man's knowledge. And the two extremes, one of them is monogrist, which is to say the decision for salvation, not the works, mind you. I think in principle, all Christians would agree, because this is really central to what it means to be a Christian, is our own works don't save us. God's work saved us. And that's why they say, well, you're a self-righteous Christian. There should never be a self-righteous Christian. A Christian is a person who admits they're not self-righteous and they need the righteousness of God. And so I'm not saying on the question of are our works contributing to our salvation, but it's the decision to be saved. Where does that come from? Is that of God? Is that of man? Is there a partnership? And it isn't a work. Just saying, I need the money, and someone says, here, I'm giving you $1 million. I didn't earn the $1 million. I didn't do anything maybe to deserve the $1 million. They just chose to give it to me, and I said, yes, I need it. I didn't work for that money. I didn't earn that money. Same thing with salvation. Faith is not a work of salvation. It's not a work. And there's plenty of scriptures that support that. Mike Winger's done it better than I could to show that. I'm not going to here. So but it comes down to this decision, and where does the decision come from? And the synergist position is that God and man cooperate in that decision. Whereas the monogrist position is, no, there's no cooperation. It's God's doing, and has nothing to do with man. And so there are scriptures that can be taken either way, honestly, and more ways besides. There are different things on this spectrum. Calvinism is known as the monogrist position. Arminianism is known as the most commonly referred to synergist position, but there's others out there that take some mix of that, and that's what I want to talk about now. The Calvinist idea is that even it goes so far as to say free will is basically an illusion. If you decide to give your life to God, it's because God has elected you to do so. If you decide not to, it's because he's chosen not to elect you to do so, and you're going to hell. And if things happen in this world because God wants them to happen. And it's almost, again, free will is an illusion. Arminianism says, no, God paid the price. He saved everybody, and he invites man to accept his free gift. And some choose to, and some choose not to. Now, Arminianism does not exclude God's foreknowledge. And it can, and that's why open theism is compatible with Arminianism, but classic Arminianism does not exclude God's foreknowledge. God knew you would make the choice you're making, but you are making it. And so, the issue has been raised, well, then isn't that's just really equivalent to the Calvinist position, because he created me knowing that I would turn down his salvation. And so why am I at fault? There's even a passage in Romans that says people will try to do that. And I think that it applies. It applies to not all the unsaved, as we'll go on here. You'll see, I think it does apply to a narrow group of people, though. But it doesn't apply with the broad brush that many Calvinists make it out to. That's Romans chapter 9, 12. Anyway, it's in Romans. So the Calvinist position is on one end, the Arminian position is the other. Then there's been a couple around. They've been around for a while, but they're just not as popular or as well known. One of them is Molinism. It's from the 16th century, because people have thought about this for a long time. And in Molinism, God knows every possible world. We make our own decisions, but he navigates around our human choice. He influences human choice through his actions in the world, but he works around human choice to bring his desired world. And he may not know which choice you will make today, but he knows the outcome of that choice, and he influences you to make a certain choice. So whatever you decide, God knows what the consequences will be. He doesn't necessarily know what choice you will make, but if you go this way, he knows what that will do. If you go this way, he knows what that will do to the total picture. And he keeps acting and trying and influencing and bring about his desired world. So we can say that with regard to the macro level, it's monogerism. God alone decides everything, in the sense that the outcome, the big picture of here's how many got saved versus here's how many got damned, God molded that and shaped that, and it wasn't our doing. But it's synergistic on the micro level, and more Arminian in the sense that God was working around our choices. He really gave us choices. Free will is not an illusion. God is sovereign, but he doesn't exercise the power that he exercises. He backs off and gives us space to have some free will. And then there's the Lutheran position. And the Lutheran position is different from all of those. It leaves, and everything I'm going to do when I go on to the next screen, although most of them would probably be shocked to hear it and say, gee, this is not where I would take this at all. But I'm riffing off the Lutheran position. Now, it's not incompatible with some of these others, but it is its own thing. And the Lutheran position is that God is completely responsible for our salvation, and we are completely responsible for our condemnation. That is, humans have ordinary free will, but that decision to say, I am no good, I need God, I need to repent, my life needs to go and be replaced with a new life in Christ. That's something that no man could decide on his own power. We don't have that kind of free will. God has to enable us. We can't say yes without God doing it. But we can say no. We can still tell him no. Because of that, the way they put it is, he is completely responsible for our salvation, and we are completely responsible for our condemnation. And I didn't even know how to draw on this chart, except I put the arrow to monogerism as respect to salvation. I would put an arrow the other way with respect to our condemnation, but that doesn't work either, because this chart, the other way is God and man are deciding together, and the Lutherans say no. When it comes to condemnation, God and man are not deciding together. Man decides. So it's like, ironically, many of those who are Arminians say on Judgment Day, it'll either be we say to God, thy will be done, or he says to us, thy will be done, whether we go to heaven or hell. And the new one is open theism. Open theism, and this is the new one. And I think a lot of open theism is a response to the argument that is in Romans, where people say, well, now, either God makes the choice for us if Calvinism is true, or if Arminianism is true, he knew the choice we were going to make. If God is omniscient, he knew the choice we were going to make before he ever created us. Okay, you say, well, he didn't make the choice for us, he just had foreknowledge. Okay, but he still created us knowing we'd make that choice. And then he's going to send us into hell for eternity. And Molinism is an attempt to deal with this, and open theism is an attempt to deal with this that makes them feel like what the Lutherans have already decided, that we're responsible for our own condemnation, but God is responsible for our salvation. So open theism goes even further than Molinism does, in that it denies God knows the future acts of libertarian free will creatures, except in cases where he decides to restrain that freedom. And maybe there are many such cases, and maybe there are some elect that he's not going to give them a choice. They're going to be saved because he's going to make sure and take away that part of their free will, but it's going to be for their good. So he knows everything as it happens. He doesn't know in advance. Whereas Molinism is like, well, God doesn't know which choice, but whatever choice you would make, he'd know the outcome. So those are the positions. And I want to talk about what that can mean, and how the Christ-centered model opens up new possibilities. Now, I want to start by explaining why the Christ-centered model for early Genesis uniquely opens the door to other possibilities and answers to these questions. In the Christ-centered model, along with many of the early Christians believe this, when the Jews saw the anthropomorphic form of God in the Old Testament, that was God the Son. It wasn't God the Father. The anthropomorphic form of God, the human form, walking in the garden, wrestling with Jacob, being the high priest Melchizedek, being the angel of the Lord who received worship and spoke as God. That was God the Son. And he didn't hop in and out of human form, Christophanies, over and over and over again. It happened one time, in the beginning. He took whatever form he was before as the Word, as the Son, the one unique Son of God, and uncreated God merged with created humanity, and he became the heavenly man, the head of the church. And from there, he created mankind and did all the interactions that you see in the Old Testament. This was not in mortal flesh. It was not an incarnation, because it wasn't the flesh as we have. It is what we will have when we are with him and we see him, and because we see him as he really is, we become like him, as it says in 1 Corinthians, because we see him as he really is. And so perhaps at that point, when we do, he will become what he was before, but he became the King of Heaven. He became the heavenly man to interact with human history. When it's over, he may or may not. That part doesn't matter, but the point is, he changed form in Genesis 1:27, and then throughout the Bible, and even now, he is seated at the right hand of God the Father. The first verse of Revelation indicates that he still has limited knowledge, because God had to give him the revelation in the book of Revelation. So, and there's no doubt he had limited knowledge on earth. Someone touched him and healing power went forth from him, and he said, "Who touched me?" And they said, all these people are pressing on you. And he didn't know. And of course, he didn't know the hour of the day when this world would end either, according to the end of John. But I want to point out, since I am saying that the anthropomorphic form of God in the Old Testament was God the Son and not God the Father, that was the heavenly man coming down and interacting with us. And I'm saying that it's the same form Christ has now, because what he said in the Gospels was, I came down and I'm going to go back, I'm going to return to where I was. And so even now, he's back in the state he was in before. Was that state an all-knowing state? From the first verse of Revelation, it doesn't seem so now. It wasn't when he was incarnate on earth. And I would point out, in the Old Testament, Yahweh does not seem, there are times when he's genuinely surprised. Some of it may be rhetorical questions, like when he asks, where's your brother? That's a rhetorical question. But when he asks, did you eat the fruit that I commanded you not to eat? That may or may not have been a rhetorical question. But when he said in Genesis 6, it repents me that I've made the man, he was genuinely grieved and surprised and angry. It wasn't like, I made these people, these special people, they're my first people, and I'm going to wipe them out because I always knew they were going to go dirty. No, he didn't realize that till later. So it seems as if he was not omniscient even at times in the Old Testament. He told Moses, get out of the way, let me destroy the Israelites. I'll make you a greater and mightier nation than they are. And Moses basically had to talk him out of it. So he was really angry. He was really shocked, all of which would not be the case if he already knew. So what I'm suggesting is that God the Father is omniscient, but and the world was made by him, but through the Son, through the Word. And the Son stepped down from his omniscience right before a very key part of that process, the creation of man. And all through his dealings in the Old Testament, when it was God the Son doing the dealing, that was a being who shared God's nature and character, but was the heavenly man, uncreated God merged with created humanity, as Christ is now. It was not omniscient. He knew whatever his Father told him, and his Father told him what he needed, but he was not omniscient. He didn't act omniscient. He knew the end from the beginning, but we don't know that he knows every step along the way. So we get to the end of Revelation, and maybe something different will happen, but this opens up new possibilities to our question of what did God know and when did he know it? Because, well, let me get a whole nother screen for that, because I need a drink of water. God knew I was going to do that, because according to the old-style Arminian view, that God can have complete foreknowledge not only of the consequences of my actions, but what my choices will be. But the Christ-centered model opens up some possible caveats to that. We're Trinitarians, right? God is three persons. They share the same nature, though. So what if God has that sort of complete foreknowledge of our future choices because he's sovereign, but does each member of the Trinity have that same foreknowledge of the other's choices on the same grounds? In most cases, it shouldn't matter. Why? Because they have the same nature. Given the same perspective, given the same information, they have the same character, so they're going to make the same choices. So it doesn't matter whether he has that kind of knowledge and sovereignty over, not only do I know what the consequences of your choices will be, but I know what your future choices are going to be, that he has over humans. With the different persons of the Trinity, they have knowledge of each other's character. So as long as they have the same perspective, they're going to know the other person's choices. Not because for the same reasons they might know your choices or my future choices, but because they know each other and because they have the same nature. But what happens if you take one member of the Trinity and change their perspective? One of them gives up omniscience takes the form of the heavenly man and interacts with flawed humans and a creation that has a tendency to do its own thing and towards chaos and futility. Well, maybe the other members of the Trinity have that kind of foreknowledge, or maybe every time that member who has put aside their omniscience for a time and taken the form of the heavenly man, maybe every time that being makes choices that affect all the humans' choices, there's a reset. Because if that being makes a choice and the Father only, his omniscience is limited by once that being makes a choice, then I'll know all the future consequences, and then I'll know all the future choices of all the people. But as long as that being, my son, who stepped aside of his omniscience, he still has my nature. I know what he would want to do, but he makes choices, he makes decisions, and those affect the choices and the decisions of others. And so while I would know what they would choose if they were all left to their own, we now have this one being in there, and I don't know his future choices and actions until he does them. And then that affects other people's choices and actions. So I would have classic Arminian complete foreknowledge unless I send my son down there for whom I do not have such knowledge. I've always relied on him being of the same nature as me and having the same perspective as me, and I would know what he would do because of that. But now that he's taken this form, merged with humanity and became the heavenly man, I don't have that same perspective. And so it sort of resets things every time. Basically, every time this figure in the Old Testament, the anthropomorphic form of God, interacted with humans, it changed something. And that continued right up until Jesus was ascended into heaven and came to the earth for the very last time. And then that X factor is out. And from that point forward, it's finished. It's done. From that point on, God knows who's going to be unsaved, who's going to perish eternally. And he himself put the factor in that allowed that to be clouded for a time. Okay, that was all part of his plan. So it really is like you may be the one to set the situation up, but you don't have the kind of foreknowledge that the bad guys are saying, well, God has done this. Why is he holding me to account? Because he did this, and it may be my free choice, but he created me knowing that I would make this free choice. Not necessarily. Not if the Christ-centered model for early Genesis is correct. He may have very cleverly, to put it mildly, found a loophole to where you can have free will, but he can have complete knowledge of your future choices, and yet he didn't. He put in just enough of a variable there to where he didn't, even though he can, and now he can. Everyone alive today, he already knows if you're going to make it or if you're not. But did he know until the ascension? No, because his son was there who had given up his omniscience, who was interacting with humans and changing the choices of those humans. So there was a free agent there. You have to ask yourself, free agency, we may not have free agency, but each member of the Trinity has free agency. And they always work in harmony when they have the same perspective. And then sometimes the Son goes on earth and he says, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. At that point, they had different wills. Not because they had different natures, but because they had different perspectives. And so I call this it's really hyper-limited open theism, because the open theism is limited to the members of the Trinity, and then only when they come and act on earth does that create a situation where God doesn't know everyone's future choices? And then they stop that act, and God immediately knows everybody's future choices again. And then they act again, and that might change a few things. But as soon as they do, God knows it again. But while that act is going on, it reshuffles the deck, and he doesn't know. When that person of the Trinity quits acting on earth, as is the case now, things are set, and God knows. And we're just waiting for history to play itself out, which is going to be in victory for Christ. So, if you are a theologian, if you're a Christian, I ask you to consider this view. I'm not married to this view. It's just something that I notice the Christ-centered model keeps solving so many problems. I see problems in history, in science, and theology. And I look and I say, wait a minute, this resolves that controversy. This could be another one of those things. I'd like your input. You let me know. Say, well, wait, what about this? What about that? That's how you test a hypothesis, is we're going to test it against Scripture and see what we get. If you're an unbeliever who is being just so confident that God is not righteous because he's created you knowing that you would be sent to hell for rejecting him because you've decided that it's kind of circular, really. But if that's you, my message is, don't be so sure. He actually might be a little smarter than you are, and he's thought of that, and there's this way around it. And it hasn't been revealed until now, to these crazy times where men are just mad enough to think that they might possibly be more righteous than the God who gave us life. Anyway, I do thank you for listening, and may God bless you all.